For 20 long years, Commander Vael of the Kaelan Dominion carried a cold, unyielding hatred in her heart for the human race. As a young girl on the agricultural moon of Oakhaven, she had watched the skies turn into a blanket of burning ash when orbital strikes wiped out her entire community. The official Dominion history archives were absolute in their verdict. Human raiders, driven by primitive greed and an insatiable appetite for destruction, had fired the mass driver cannons that turned her home into a desolate graveyard. That trauma forged Vael into a formidable military leader, a woman whose entire career was built on the absolute conviction that humanity was a plague that needed to be contained, controlled, or outright eradicated from the galaxy. Every morning, Vael looked at her reflection in the polished hull of her battlecruiser, the Radiant Blade, and reminded herself of her sacred vow to never trust a human. However, galactic politics recently forced a bitter compromise upon the Dominion's high command. To prevent a full-scale interstellar conflict that neither side could truly afford, a fragile treaty was signed, requiring alien flagships to host human auxiliary engineering units. To Vael, this was nothing short of treason against those who had fallen at Oakhaven, but orders were orders. When the human service crew boarded her ship, she made it her personal mission to enforce strict isolation, treating them not as allies or guests, but as untrustworthy prisoners bound by forced labor agreements. Among the newly assigned human crew was a quiet, unassuming salvage engineer named Leo Vance. While the other human personnel walked with an anxious stiffness under the sharp glares of the Kaelan guards, Leo moved through the passageways with a calm, deliberate silence. He was a man of few words, bearing deep, faded burn scars along his neck and hands, marks of a life spent in the perilous depths of starship maintenance bays. Vael immediately targeted him, assigning Vance to the most grueling, hazardous maintenance routines in the ship's lower engine corridors, secretly hoping the pressure would force him to break so she could have a legitimate reason to dismiss him from her command. The tension aboard the Radiant Blade reached a dangerous high as the vessel navigated the treacherous asteroid belts near the outer border. Vael monitored the lower decks from her command bridge, half expecting the human engineers to sabotage the vessel or shirk their duties under the heavy workload she had imposed. Instead, telemetry reports showed that Leo Vance was working double shifts without a single word of complaint, silently fixing system failures that had plagued the ship's aging power grid for months. Despite her deep-seated prejudice, Vael found his refusal to break deeply unsettling, as it directly contradicted everything she had been taught about human arrogance and volatility. Disaster struck during a sudden, unpredicted gravitational anomaly that rattled the battlecruiser to its structural core. A coolant pipe in the main plasma containment sector ruptured, flooding the compartment with superheated gas and trapping a young Kaelan technician behind an automated blast door. Alarms blared across the ship, and standard Dominion safety protocol dictated that the entire section be sealed off immediately to preserve the hull, effectively abandoning the trapped technician to a terrible fate. As Vael raised her hand to confirm the emergency purge sequence from the bridge, video feeds showed a figure darting directly into the scalding steam before the blast door could fully lock down. It was Leo Vance. Armed with only a manual override tool and wearing a standard heat-resistant jacket, the human engineer fought his way through the blinding heat to pull the unconscious alien technician from the burning chamber. By the time emergency medical teams reached the scene, Leo had successfully dragged the young crew member to safety, though the searing plasma had inflicted fresh, painful burns across his own arms and shoulder. Standing over the injured human in the medical bay later that night, a confused and furious Vael demanded to know why he had risked his life for a species that despised his kind. Leo simply looked up at her through weary eyes and quietly replied that nobody died on his watch if he had the power to stop it. In the weeks following the engine bay incident, the atmosphere aboard the Radiant Blade began to subtly shift. The Kaelan crew members, who had spent their entire lives reading propaganda about human cowardice and cruelty, could no longer ignore the fact that a human had willingly walked into a furnace to save one of their own. Vael found herself struggling with a profound sense of cognitive dissonance that kept her awake in her quarters long into the night cycles. She began spending more time on the lower decks under the pretense of conducting routine security inspections, but in truth, she was drawn toward observing the silent mechanic whose actions refused to align with her long-held beliefs. Her observations led to an unexpected encounter late one evening in the ship's quiet sub-deck observation lounge. Vael stepped inside to find Leo sitting alone near the viewscreen, meticulously soldering the frayed wiring of an ancient audio datapad while looking out at the passing nebulae. Rather than ordering him back to his quarters, Vael sat a few paces away and asked him about the strange, slow acoustic music playing softly from the device. For the first time, Leo spoke at length, sharing memories of his family's humble repair shop on Earth and the loss he had suffered during the long years of border skirmishes, revealing a depth of quiet sorrow that mirrored Vael's own buried grief. What struck Vael most about the conversation was that Leo made no attempt to defend humanity's past actions, nor did he offer cheap, hollow apologies for a war he had not fought. He simply listened to her speak about her lost home on Oakhaven with a deep, respectful empathy that no one in her own court had ever provided. Where her fellow Kalan officers offered political rhetoric or hollow pity, Leo offered genuine, unconditional understanding. As she left the lounge that night, Vael realized with a frightening surge of emotion that the burning hatred she had carried like armor for 20 years was finally beginning to crumble into dust. The fragile peace aboard the flagship was shattered when an unidentified stealth frigate emerged from the shadow of a nearby moon, opening fire on the Radiant Blade without warning. The ambush was brutal and precise, targeting the vessel's primary shield generators and knocking out internal gravity controls across the forward decks. Sirens shrieked throughout the corridors as Vael rushed to the forward auxiliary control room to stabilize the defensive matrix, with Leo and his engineering team trailing close behind to manage power distribution. Explosions rocked the structural framework, sending metal debris tearing through the passageways as the enemy ship pressed its relentless assault. As Vael stood at a tactical console issuing counterattack orders, a heavy overhead support beam buckled under the stress of an hull breach directly above her. Hearing the structural steel snap, Leo reacted before anyone else could move, sprinting across the shifting floor and shoving the commander out of the falling beam's path. The massive structure slammed into the deck with devastating force, pinning Leo beneath its weight and crushing his side. Despite the blinding pain, the human mechanic used his manual welding torch to seal an exposed fuel line just inches from his head, preventing a chain reaction explosion that would have vaporized the entire auxiliary module. With the threat temporarily neutralized by the Radiant Blade's secondary weapons, Vael personally directed the rescue effort, her hands trembling as she helped lift the structural beam off Leo's broken frame. In the medical bay, while attending to his injuries as the ship's surgeons worked around them, Vael found herself holding the human's hand, completely unbothered by who might see her. The realization hit her with overwhelming clarity: she was no longer merely respecting this man, nor was she simply tolerating his presence. Against every law of her empire and every instinct forged in the fires of her past, she had fallen deeply, completely in love with him. As Leo slowly recovered from his severe injuries in the medical sector, he refused to remain idle, insisting on using a portable terminal to assist with ship repairs from his bed. Vael visited him daily, using her authority as commander to clear her schedule under the guise of conducting tactical debriefings. The quiet hours they spent together in the medical suite solidified an unbreakable bond between them, a quiet understanding built on mutual respect and an unspoken affection that grew stronger with every shared glance. For the first time in 2 decades, Vael began to imagine a future that was not defined by vengeance or endless military preparation. However, the peaceful interlude was short-lived, as Leo's technical instincts led him to notice a dangerous anomaly in the damage logs recorded during the stealth frigate's attack. While recalibrating the main navigation computer to trace the enemy ship's warp trail, he discovered hidden encryption protocols buried deep within the ship's long-term memory banks. The weapon signatures used by the stealth vessel were oddly familiar to him, matching classified energy patterns he had studied during his training on human defense systems. Strangely, these signatures did not match any known Earth technology, despite carrying human-style registry tags. Driven by a mechanic's obsession with unraveling broken systems, Leo worked late into the night cycle to bypass the internal firewall security protocols. As he peeled back layer after layer of corrupted code, he uncovered archived telemetry data dating back precisely 20 years, the exact time frame of the destruction of Oakhaven. The deep space sensor logs revealed that the energy frequency of the weapons used in the ambush on the Radiant Blade matched the energy signatures recorded during the massacre of Vael's home moon down to the exact megawatt frequency, suggesting the same entity was responsible for both events. Convinced that he was looking at a catastrophic system error, Leo brought his findings directly to Vael in her private command sanctuary. Upon examining the decrypted data screens, Vael's initial reaction was one of defensive outrage, believing the human was attempting to manufacture a fake history to clear his species of guilt. But as she cross-referenced the raw telemetry data with the Dominion's core star mapping archives, her military training forced her to accept a terrifying reality. The data was authentic, original, and had been manually hidden from standard clearance levels by someone possessing highest-tier command access. Before Vael and Leo could investigate the origin of the hidden files any further, a massive fleet of heavy Kaelan warships dropped out of hyperspace directly surrounding the Radiant Blade. The lead battlecruiser broadcast an emergency priority signal from High Chancellor Theron himself, the supreme political leader of the Kaelan Dominion and the very man who had mentored Vael after her family was killed on Oakhaven. Theron's cold, authoritative voice filled the command bridge, announcing that intelligence had uncovered an imminent, wide-scale human conspiracy to overthrow the Dominion peace treaty from within. High Chancellor Theron demanded an immediate, unconditional lockdown of the Radiant Blade and ordered his personal honor guard to transport aboard to take custody of all human personnel. He declared that every human engineer on the ship was to be executed without trial under military martial law to prevent the spread of sabotage. Vael felt a wave of icy terror wash over her as she watched Theron's heavily armed shock troops prepare to breach her ship, realizing that the man she had looked up to as a father figure was moving with unnatural haste to silence the human crew before any questions could be asked. Vael immediately moved to block the Chancellor's troops at the main airlock, using her authority as ship commander to delay their entry while Leo rushed back to the engineering hub to secure the decrypted archives. The corridors of the Radiant Blade turned into a pressure cooker of tension, with loyal Kaelan crew members standing uncertainly between their commander's commands and the direct orders of the High Chancellor. Vael knew that open defiance meant execution for treason, but she was entirely unwilling to let Leo be slaughtered to preserve a political narrative she was beginning to deeply suspect. In the lower engineering decks, Leo worked under intense pressure as the ship's internal comms echoed with heavy footsteps approaching his station. Knowing that physical data pads would be confiscated and destroyed upon his arrest, he began routing the hidden telemetry files through the vessel's primary emergency broadcast array, locking the data behind a complex, multi-layered human repair cipher that only he knew how to fully decode. He knew that his life was effectively forfeit the moment Theron's guards breached the room, but his sole priority was ensuring that Vael received the full, unvarnished truth about her past. The heavy blast doors were cut open with plasma torches, and Theron's elite guards flooded the chamber, slamming Leo onto the metal deck and placing him in heavy energy restraints. Vael arrived moments later, her sidearm drawn, confronting the lead commander of the Honor Guard in a standoff that brought the ship to the brink of internal war. Theron himself stepped into the room, flanked by armored soldiers, his expression a mask of cold disappointment as he looked at Vael, warning her that her emotional attachment to a lower caste human was destroying her loyalty to the Dominion she had sworn to serve. High Chancellor Theron ordered all crew members to assemble in the main hangar bay for the immediate summary execution of Leo Vance and the human engineering squad, intending to turn the event into a public demonstration of Dominion strength. Hundreds of Kaelan soldiers stood in rigid formation around the perimeter, their faces filled with mixed emotions as they watched the human mechanic who had saved their fellow officer being dragged toward the execution platform. Vael stood near the center of the bay, flanked by her most trusted officers, her heart pounding violently against her ribs as she looked for any way to break the Chancellor's trap. Theron took the central podium, raising his hands to address the assembled force, delivering a passionate speech about the tragic fall of Oakhaven 20 years ago and the endless deceit of the human species. He held up a finger pointing at Leo, declaring him a dangerous spy sent to complete the work Earth started decades prior. The political theater was flawless, designed to inflame ancient hatreds and unite the fleet behind Theron's call for total galactic war, effectively resetting 2 decades of painful diplomatic progress in a single afternoon. Just as the guard captain raised his plasma pistol to the back of Leo's head, Vael stepped forward onto the platform, placing herself directly between the executioner's barrel and the man she loved. The entire hangar went dead silent as the commander turned to face the Chancellor, refusing his direct orders to step aside. When Theron warned her that she was ruining her legacy for a human lie, Vael raised her voice so it echoed across the entire chamber, declaring that the only lie present in the hangar bay was the official history the Chancellor had sold to his people for 20 years. At a discreet gesture from Vael, Leo activated his hidden override wrist comm, triggering the emergency broadcast sequence he had prepared in the engineering bay. The central holographic projectors in the hangar flickered to life, filling the massive space with towering, high-resolution telemetry maps, decrypted audio logs, and hidden military authorization codes from 2 decades ago. The visual evidence displayed the precise movement of the fleet that had destroyed Oakhaven, revealing the exact ship signatures, energy outputs, and command codes used during the massacre. The truth crashed over the assembled troops like a devastating wave. The ships that had incinerated the moon of Oakhaven 20 years ago were not human raiders at all. They were unmarked Kaelan stealth vessels operating under the direct, written orders of then-General Theron. Theron had ordered the murder of his own innocent citizens to frame Earth, using the artificial tragedy to ignite an empire-wide war, secure his absolute ascension to High Chancellor, and justify infinite military spending for his political regime. The human threat was nothing more than a bloody myth manufactured by a tyrant hungry for supreme control. Theron's face twisted into an expression of raw malice as his carefully constructed empire of deceit crumbled before his eyes. Panic erupted across the podium as his personal guards hesitated, looking at the undeniable evidence displayed above them and then back at the Chancellor they had sworn to follow. Realizing his power was evaporating in real time, Theron snatched a weapon from an aide's holster and aimed it directly at Vael, determined to silence the commander who had brought his treason to the light. Before Theron could fire his weapon, Leo threw his body forward despite his heavy restraints, tackling the Chancellor to the deck and knocking the sidearm harmlessly out of his hand. Loyal Kaelan soldiers flooded the platform, tackling the disgraced leader to the ground and placing him in the very energy cuffs he had prepared for the human crew. The hangar erupted into a chaotic mixture of shock, anger, and profound relief as officers realized their entire history of war had been built on a tragic falsehood, effectively ending the centuries-old feud with humanity in a matter of seconds. In the aftermath of the coup attempt, High Chancellor Theron and his conspirators were stripped of their ranks and placed on trial before a newly formed Supreme Council, while Earth was completely exonerated of all historical charges. The Kaelan Dominion issued a formal, public apology to humanity, establishing a genuine peace treaty built on shared truth rather than manufactured fear. Vael stepped down from her military command of the Radiant Blade, choosing to leave the life of war behind her to serve as the chief ambassador for the new Interspecies Peace Commission. On the reconstructed observation deck of Oakhaven's new orbital station, Vael stood watching the sunrise over her rebuilding homeworld, no longer haunted by the ghosts of her past. Leo walked up behind her, placing a warm hand on her shoulder, his touch a comforting reminder of how far they had both come from the days of hatred and mistrust. Looking out into the vast, open cosmos together, the alien commander and the human mechanic embraced, ready to build a new era for the galaxy. One defined not by the lies of the past, but by the quiet strength of their love. If you like the video, make sure to like and subscribe my channel.